In Russia, behind barbed wire and armed checkpoints, an entire parallel civilization exists. 42 cities that appear on no map, home to over 1.5 million people who cannot tell their families where they live. These are the closed cities of the USSR, and their existence represents one of the most audacious experiments in social control and scientific ambition the world has ever seen. This is Blueprint. The year is 1946. World War II has ended, but physicist Igor Kurchatov understands that a new kind of war has already begun. In a converted monastery outside Moscow, he receives orders directly from Stalin. Build the atomic bomb, match the Americans, do whatever it takes. The Soviet Union has no uranium enrichment facilities, no weapons-grade plutonium production, no infrastructure for nuclear research on the scale required. Kurchatov needs more than laboratories. He needs entire cities. Arzamas-16 becomes the first. The official name means nothing. The location, 400 kilometers east of Moscow, appears blank on Soviet maps. The actual town of Sarov, with its monasteries and wooden houses, simply vanishes from cartography. In its place rises something unprecedented. Apartment blocks constructed to higher standards than those in Moscow. Shops stocked with goods unavailable elsewhere in the Soviet Union. A physics institute that will employ 5,000 scientists at its peak. The perimeter fence stretches for 75 kilometers. Guard towers every 200 meters. Dogs patrol at night. To leave requires written permission from the KGB. Yuli Khariton arrives in 1947 to lead the weapons program. He is 43 years old, already a respected physicist, and he will remain in Arzamas-16 for the next 45 years. His wife and children come with him. They will grow up behind the fence, attend schools behind the fence, marry people behind the fence. When Khariton's daughter asks to visit her grandmother in Leningrad, the request goes through 3 levels of security approval. The trip is denied. The scientists work in building number 9. A structure that will become the Soviet Los Alamos. They sleep 4 to a room in the early years. Their calculations spread across shared desks. Their coffee cold because the heating system cannot keep up with Siberian winters. But the work proceeds. By 1949, 3 years after ground was broken, they detonate RDS-1, the first Soviet atomic bomb. The Americans, who predicted the Soviets would need at least a decade, detect the test on August 29th. President Truman receives the news with disbelief. His advisors scramble to understand how the Soviet Union closed the gap so quickly. The answer lies not just in espionage, though Klaus Fuchs and the Rosenberg network certainly accelerated Soviet progress. The answer lies in the closed city model itself. When you concentrate thousands of the brightest minds in one location, provide them with resources unavailable to the rest of the country, and seal them off from outside distractions and surveillance, you create conditions for remarkable productivity. You also create conditions for remarkable control. Chelyabinsk-40 opens in 1948 on the site of a village cleared of its 8,000 inhabitants. The residents receive 48 hours notice. Their houses are bulldozed before they finish packing. Here, the Soviets will produce weapons-grade plutonium in reactors cooled by the Techa River. Chemical engineer Yefim Slavsky oversees construction. He is 40 years old and answers directly to Lavrenti Beria, head of the Soviet atomic project and Stalin's secret police chief. Slavsky's instructions are explicit: produce plutonium faster than the Americans, regardless of cost. The first reactor, codenamed Anushka, goes critical in June 1948. There is no containment building. The reactor sits in an underground chamber, its waste piped directly into the Techa River. Within months, fish in the river die. Within a year, residents of villages downstream begin showing symptoms of radiation poisoning. The medical staff at Chelyabinsk-40 document hair loss, bleeding gums, immune system collapse. The information is classified. The villages are not evacuated. The reactors continue operating. By 1951, 5 reactors churn out plutonium at Chelyabinsk-40. The city population reaches 50,000. Workers live in apartment blocks painted cheerful colors, shop in stores that stock fresh oranges and imported chocolate, attend theaters and swimming pools and sports facilities. Their children attend elite schools, where class sizes never exceed 20 students. The contrast with conditions outside the fence is stark. In the surrounding region, collective farms struggle with food shortages. Cities lack basic consumer goods. But inside Chelyabinsk-40, the elite of the Soviet nuclear program live comfortable, even privileged lives. The price of this comfort is silence about the work they perform and the consequences it produces. September 29th, 1957. Storage tank number 14 at Chelyabinsk. 40 contains 80 tons of high-level radioactive waste. The cooling system fails. The temperature inside the tank rises. At 4:20 p.m., the tank explodes with a force equivalent to 70 tons of TNT. The concrete lid, weighing 160 tons, is blown off. A plume of radioactive material rises 2 kilometers into the air. The cloud drifts northeast, contaminating an area of 23,000 square kilometers. More than 270,000 people receive radiation doses. 10,000 residents of the most contaminated areas are evacuated, their villages plowed under and buried. The Soviet government says nothing. The international community knows nothing. Inside Chelyabinsk-40, now renamed Chelyabinsk-65 as part of a city renumbering scheme, workers continue their shifts. The plutonium production schedule cannot be interrupted. By the 1960s, residents begin developing cancers at elevated rates. The medical data is collected, analyzed, and classified. Doctors at the facility publish research papers using patient data but cannot reveal where the patients come from or how they were exposed to radiation. They refer to Chelyabinsk-65 as the Enterprise in their papers. The location appears as postal box number such and such. The scientific literature fills with euphemisms and careful omissions. The closed city model spreads across the Soviet Union. Krasnoyarsk, 26 in Siberia, houses plutonium reactors built inside a mountain. Salatust, 36, produces nuclear weapons components. Sverdlovsk, 44, enriches uranium. Each city exists in legal limbo, administered directly by Moscow, subject to its own security protocols. The residents hold internal passports stamped with the city's code number. These passports allow them to live and work inside the fence but mark them as different suspects when they travel outside. Not all closed cities serve the nuclear program. Krasnoznamensk, 40 kilometers outside Moscow, houses the headquarters of Soviet military intelligence, the GRU. The city exists to support 5,000 intelligence officers and their families. Zelenogorsk hosts a space surveillance complex tracking American satellites. Vilyuchinsk, on the Kamchatka Peninsula, serves as a submarine base for nuclear ballistic missile submarines. The submarines dock in underground pens carved from rock, invisible to American reconnaissance satellites. Each closed city develops its own culture, its own peculiar ecosystem of privilege and paranoia. In Arzamas-16, scientists hold seminars where they debate quantum mechanics and philosophy, their discussions monitored but largely tolerated. The security services understand that intellectual freedom within limits produces better weapons. In Chelyabinsk-65, workers develop elaborate systems of dark humor about their work. They refer to themselves as plutonium people. When someone's hair falls out or their children are born with defects, the jokes become more pointed, more desperate. The humor is a pressure valve, a way to acknowledge what cannot be openly discussed. Life inside the fence follows strict hierarchies. Scientists and senior engineers live in the best apartments, shop in the best stores, send their children to specialized schools where English and German are taught from first grade. Technicians and laborers live in simpler housing, have access to fewer goods, but still live better than their counterparts outside the fence. Everyone understands the hierarchy. Everyone knows their place. The system rewards compliance and punishes curiosity about the world beyond the checkpoint. Young people grow up knowing only the closed city. They attend kindergarten behind the fence, elementary school behind the fence, high school behind the fence. Their textbooks are the same as those used throughout the Soviet Union, but their world is fundamentally different. They cannot travel freely. They cannot speak freely about their parents' work. When they come of age, many leave for university in Moscow or Leningrad or Novosibirsk. They discover that their internal passports mark them as different. Roommates ask questions they cannot answer. They develop elaborate cover stories about where they're from, what their parents do. Some adapt, some retreat back to the closed cities, where at least everyone shares the same secrets. By the 1970s, the closed city system reaches its peak. 42 cities are closed to varying degrees. The total population exceeds 1.5 million. These cities account for a disproportionate share of Soviet scientific output. Papers published by researchers at postal box institutions appear in international journals, the actual locations carefully obscured. Soviet nuclear weapons designers working in cities that don't officially exist correspond with American counterparts about arms control treaties. The Americans know the designers' names but cannot pinpoint where they work. The system succeeds in its way. The Soviet Union achieves nuclear parity with the United States. Soviet missiles match American missiles in number and capability. Submarines armed with ballistic missiles patrol the Pacific and Atlantic. The scientists and engineers in the closed cities make this possible. The question of what this success costs in human terms, in environmental damage, in the creation of a two-tier society is not asked in official forums. The question exists in whispers, in private conversations, in the unstated awareness that something fundamental has been sacrificed. April 26, 1986. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant explodes. The disaster is not in a closed city, but many of the specialists sent to manage the crisis come from them. Engineers from Chelyabinsk-40 and Arzamas-16 fly to Ukraine to assess the damage and direct the cleanup. They understand radiation in ways that civilian authorities do not. They understand what it means when a reactor core is exposed to the air, when graphite is burning and releasing radioactive particles across Europe. They also understand that the Soviet system's obsession with secrecy and central control contributed to the disaster. The engineers who designed the RBMK reactors knew about safety flaws, but could not publicly challenge the decision to deploy them. The culture of closed cities, of classified information, and limited accountability extends beyond the fences into the entire Soviet nuclear establishment. Physicist Andrei Sakharov, who worked in Arzamas-16 for nearly 2 decades and helped develop the Soviet hydrogen bomb, has by 1986 been exiled to Gorky for his human rights advocacy. He writes essays about the closed cities, about the moral compromises required to work in them, about the environmental damage they inflict. His words circulate in samizdat, copied by hand and passed from reader to reader. Zakharov argues that the closed city system represents everything wrong with Soviet society: the elevation of state secrets over human welfare, the creation of privileged castes, the poisoning of land and water for military goals. His former colleagues in Arzamas-16 read his essays and argue late into the night about whether he is right, whether the work they do justifies the costs. The Soviet Union collapses in 1991. The closed cities face an existential crisis. Their funding disappears almost overnight. The Moscow bureaucracies that manage them disintegrate. Scientists and engineers who once worked on weapons projects find themselves without salaries. Some leave for positions in the West, their expertise suddenly valuable to American and European institutions. Others stay out of loyalty or lack of options and watch their cities decay. Apartment blocks fall into disrepair, stores empty. The privileges that once compensated for isolation vanish. The Russian Federation, inheriting the Soviet nuclear arsenal, cannot simply abandon the closed cities. The weapons still exist. The plutonium production reactors at Chelyabinsk-40, though shut down, require monitoring for decades. The uranium enrichment facilities at Sverdlovsk-44 hold tons of weapons-grade material. These cities must continue to exist. but now without the resources that once supported them. The residents find themselves in a peculiar purgatory, still closed, still restricted, but no longer privileged. Some closed cities adapt. Sarov, the post-Soviet name for Arzamas-16, maintains its nuclear weapons research institute, but also develops civilian technologies. The city markets itself as a secure location for data centers and research facilities. The fence remains, the checkpoints remain, but now they are marketed as assets, guarantees of security and stability in a chaotic country. Other closed cities struggle. Ozersk, the post-Soviet name for Chelyabinsk-45, grapples with environmental contamination so severe that cleanup may take centuries. The Teka River remains radioactive. Lake Karachay, used as a dumping ground for nuclear waste, is one of the most contaminated places on Earth. The residents, many of whom worked in the facilities that caused the contamination, now live with its consequences. Today, 10 closed cities remain fully restricted in Russia. Another 32 have partial restrictions. The total population has declined to under 1 million as people move away and restrictions ease. But the system persists. Snezhinsk and Zelenogorsk continue nuclear weapons research. Vilyuchinsk still serves as a submarine base. The Russian government justifies the continued restrictions on grounds of national security, but the closed cities now represent something else as well: historical inertia, institutional resistance to change, and a continued belief that isolation can be a form of protection. The scientists who worked in Arzamas-16 and Chelyabinsk-45 during the Soviet era are mostly retired now or dead. Their memoirs, published after the collapse, reveal complex attitudes toward their work. Some express pride in their technical achievements, in matching the Americans despite inferior resources. Some express guilt about the environmental damage and the health effects on workers and nearby residents. Most express a kind of cognitive dissonance, awareness that they participated in something morally problematic, alongside genuine belief that they served a necessary purpose. They built weapons of mass destruction, yet they also kept the peace through deterrence. They poisoned rivers and land, yet they also provided wealth for their families. They lived in cities that offered privilege and comfort, yet those cities were also prisons. The environmental legacy of the closed cities will persist for millennia. The contaminated zones around Chelyabinsk require management until the radioactive isotopes decay, which for some elements means tens of thousands of years. The groundwater contamination spreads slowly through aquifers, invisible but measurable. The residents of villages downstream from the nuclear facilities show elevated cancer rates decades after the worst contamination. The medical studies continue, though now they can at least name the locations and acknowledge the source of exposure. What do we make of the closed cities? They represent human ingenuity at its most impressive and its most disturbing. Soviet scientists, working under conditions of extreme secrecy and pressure, achieved remarkable breakthroughs in nuclear physics, materials, science, and weapons design. They matched a rival superpower with far greater resources. They did this by creating hermetically sealed communities where talent was concentrated and protected from the chaos and deprivation afflicting the rest of Soviet society. But this achievement came at enormous cost. Environmental destruction on a scale still being discovered, health effects still being measured, and the creation of a system that valued secrets over safety and state power over individual freedom. The residents of the closed cities were both privileged and exploited. They lived better than most Soviet citizens. They also lived under constant surveillance, their movements restricted, their mail opened, their phone calls monitored. They knew that their work contributed to weapons that could destroy civilization. Yet they also believed, mostly sincerely, that their work prevented war through deterrence. They raised children behind fences and taught them not to ask questions about what happened at work. They created communities with excellent schools and theaters and sports facilities. Communities that were also fundamentally artificial, sustained only by state power and secrecy. The closed cities reveal something essential about the Soviet system and perhaps about modernity itself. The 20th century produced technologies, nuclear weapons, space exploration, advanced computing that seemed to require total mobilization and control. The closed cities were laboratories for this kind of total control. They demonstrated that you could create islands of efficiency and scientific productivity through coercion and isolation. They also demonstrated the costs of that approach: environmental catastrophe, human exploitation, moral compromise, and ultimately unsustainability. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the closed cities could not maintain themselves. The artificial nature of their existence became clear. Can a society sustain cities built on secrets? Can scientific progress be separated from human welfare and environmental responsibility? The closed cities suggest the answer is no, or at least not indefinitely. The scientists in Arzamas-16 and Chelyabinsk-40 believed they were building a better future, protecting their country, serving a cause larger than themselves. They were also poisoning rivers, exposing workers to lethal radiation, and creating weapons designed to annihilate millions. Both things were true simultaneously. History does not offer easy judgments. The fences still stand around Sarov and Snezhinsk and Zelenogorsk. The guard towers are manned. Residents still carry special passports. The closed cities have not disappeared. They have merely become less relevant as Russia's nuclear arsenal ages and the country's scientific ambitions shrink. But the model they represent, the idea that you can separate a segment of society, lavish it with resources, demand total loyalty, and achieve extraordinary results, retains appeal for authoritarian systems. China has created closed research facilities for artificial intelligence and quantum computing. Other countries eye the model for emerging technologies. The lesson some draw from the Soviet closed cities is not about their costs, but about their effectiveness. Perhaps the real question is not whether the closed cities succeeded or failed, but what success and failure mean in this context. Did they succeed because they produced nuclear weapons and matched American capabilities? Did they fail because they poisoned vast regions and created unsustainable communities? Or are these the wrong questions, abstractions that miss the human reality of 1.5 million people who lived their lives behind fences, who raised children and fell in love and pursued careers in cities that officially did not exist? The echoes from the closed cities gradually being declassified reveal ordinary human dramas playing out in extraordinary circumstances. Love letters between scientists separated by security classifications. Reports of workers concealing radiation symptoms to keep their jobs. School essays by children describing their hometowns without being able to name them. These documents remind us that history is made by individuals making choices, often impossible choices, within systems that constrain and shape their options. The babushkas who sell vegetables at the markets in Sarov today grew up in Arzamas-16. They remember when the stores had fresh meat every day, when the schools had equipment that Moscow universities envied, when life behind the fence felt like privilege rather than restriction. They also remember the secrecy, the fear of saying the wrong thing to the wrong person, the knowledge that something about their lives was fundamentally abnormal. When you ask them whether it was worth it, whether the Soviet closed cities were justified, they often shrug. What answer can encompass such complexity? The rivers still flow past the ruined reactors. The birch forests still grow on contaminated soil. The cities still stand, some thriving, some declining, all bearing the weight of their history. The closed cities of the USSR were an audacious experiment in social engineering and scientific mobilization. They achieved their immediate objectives while creating problems that will persist for centuries. They elevated a privileged few while exposing thousands to harm. They advanced human knowledge while demonstrating the dangers of unchecked state power. Somewhere in the archives of Sarov, formerly Arzamas-16, there exists a photograph from 1953. It shows a group of young physicists, fresh from Moscow universities, arriving at their new home. They stand in front of the checkpoint, their faces bright with enthusiasm and ambition. They do not yet know that they will spend decades behind the fence, that some of them will die from radiation exposure, that their children will grow up not knowing the names of nearby cities. They know only that they have been chosen for important work, that they are joining something significant. Their expressions capture a moment of optimism before the complexities and compromises begin. History will debate the closed cities for decades. Were they necessary? Were there alternatives? Could the Soviet Union have maintained nuclear parity without creating these sealed communities? Could the environmental damage have been avoided? Could the residents have been treated more humanely? These questions matter, but they may ultimately be unanswerable. What we can say is that the closed cities existed, that millions of people lived in them, and that their legacy, scientific, environmental, and human, continues to shape our world. The last question, perhaps, is for us. We live in an age of renewed great power competition, of technological races in artificial intelligence and biotechnology and space exploration. We face the temptation to believe that security requires secrecy, that progress requires sacrifice, that national interests justify extraordinary measures. The closed cities of the USSR offer a cautionary tale about where that logic leads. They also offer a reminder that the people implementing these systems, the scientists and engineers and workers, are not monsters or heroes, but human beings trying to navigate impossible situations. What would we have done in their place? What compromises would we accept? At what point would we refuse? These questions are not historical curiosities. They are questions we may each face in different forms in our own lives. The closed cities make us confront uncomfortable truths about state power, scientific responsibility, and individual agency. They offer no easy answers, only the reminder that our choices matter and that the consequences of those choices can persist for generations. The fences still stand. The questions remain.